The day everything exploded, I was still smelling fresh cemetery dirt on my shoes, standing in my driveway in a black suit that didn't fit right anymore, when the certified envelope landed in my hands like a brick. And that's how. On the day I buried my father, I learned that an HOA believed I owed them $250,000 for violations on land my grandfather paid for in cash before their entire neighborhood even existed. My name is Ethan Marquez, 42 years old, third-generation builder, which really just means my hands have more scars than my heart does. And the 3 acres where all this went down sit on the edge of a town called Redwood Crossing, a piece of earth my grandfather Rafael Marquez bought in 1953 when this was nothing but fields and cattle and a dirt road that turned to mud every time it rained. The house is small, 1 story, sagging in places but still solid. But the real soul of the place is the workshop, that long metal building where my grandfather welded, my dad wired. And now I teach my 16-year-old daughter Lena how to hold a drill the way he taught me. The smell of hot steel and sawdust mixing with motor oil and memories. Around us, though, the world changed. In 2004, a developer called Crestline Communities bought up the land around our property, carved it into cul-de-sacs and driveways, put up stone entrance signs, and planted matching trees, and christened the subdivision Silver Pines Reserve. They offered my grandfather $400,000 to sell everything and disappear, and he just laughed, told them this soil had already been bought once with sweat and overtime shifts, and he didn't sell anything that carried his name. When he died, it passed to my dad, and when my dad died, it came to me, along with his stubborn spine and a filing cabinet full of documents. Then came the HOA royalty. The self-appointed queen of Silver Pines Reserve is Heather Langford, late 30s, hyper-blonde hair that never moves, heels that click like a metronome of bad decisions, perfume so strong you can taste it before you see her. She lives in a 4,000-square-foot mini-mansion with an imported fountain out front, and she runs the Silver Pines Reserve Homeowners Association like it's a private kingdom, and the bylaws are scripture she personally wrote. At first it was little things. Noise complaints because I fired up tools at 7 a.m., even though city ordinance says 6. Demands that I move equipment so it wouldn't damage property values for homes that didn't exist when my grandfather built that shop. She started slow, a warning letter here, a fake courtesy notice there, always ending with "for the good of the community," like that phrase was a weapon. And then, on the afternoon of my father's funeral, still wearing a tie, eyes burning from crying and no sleep, I signed for a certified letter stamped with the seal of Silver Pines Reserve HOA, and before I even opened it, I smelled that same suffocating floral perfume behind me. Timing's unfortunate, Ethan, but we can't delay enforcement, Heather said, voice soft, eyes hard, black dress like she thought she was at the same funeral I had just left, and she handed me another stack of papers like she was passing out coupons instead of threats. The letter demanded $250,000 in fines for unauthorized structures, non-compliant commercial use, and environmental violations, with a schedule of daily penalties that looked like they wanted to bleed me out slowly. According to the paperwork, their HOA covenants bound my land the way their rules bound every stucco box inside the subdivision. Only problem was, my land existed half a century before Silver Pines Reserve was even a sketch in some developer's office. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm not an idiot either. That night, after my relatives left and the house went quiet, I sat in my dad's old office, still smelling his aftershave on the chair, and dug into his filing cabinets. There it was, the original 1953 deed, yellowed but crisp, Rafael Marquez's signature, county seal, meets and bounds describing our 3 acres long before Crestline Communities showed up. No HOA, no encumbrances, no signatures tying us to any future association. Their covenants might rule inside Silver Pines Reserve, but we were never part of it. We were the island they built around, not a lot they sold. Still, Heather wasn't interested in reality, just control. At the next HOA meeting, in the Silver Pines Reserve Clubhouse, she clicked around the room with a PowerPoint titled Industrial Threat in Residential Zone, pointing to photos of my workshop like she was presenting evidence in a trial. I walked in halfway through, dropped copies of my deed and tax records on the table, explained that my land predated their development by 51 years and had never been annexed, and she waved a manicured hand like I was a child interrupting adults. He's trying to exempt himself from community standards, Heather told the room, voice dripping with contempt. The board, all people she'd stacked there, voted to proceed with enforcement. I told her, quietly, "You really should get a second legal opinion before this gets expensive," and she smiled like she'd already won. That's when I called Ava Delgado, a property rights attorney with a reputation for dismantling overreaching HOAs. And her first advice was simple: document everything, don't rise to the bait, and start digging into records, because bullies hate daylight. While Heather was sending me letter after letter and calling city inspectors on me, I was spending my evenings in the basement of the Riverside County Recorder's office, under flickering lights, pulling old plats, road dedications, water agreements, anything tied to our land. The first crack showed up in the 2004 subdivision plat for Silver Pines Reserve. Crestline Communities' surveyor had drawn several lot lines a few feet too far onto my side. Not just a fence or a flower bed, but foundations, driveways, and the entire HOA playground. Then deeper in the files, in a dusty folder labeled Water Rights 1950 to 1960, I found something else. A 1954 agreement granting Rafael Marquez exclusive rights to a natural spring at the north end of our land. The same spring that, on newer drawings, fed the retention pond and irrigation system for the entire subdivision. So while Heather was threatening to find me into oblivion for a workshop that's been there longer than she's been alive, her entire neighborhood had been built partly on my land, fed by my water, with no one ever asking permission. And I hadn't even started fighting back yet. Once Ava Delgado saw the plat maps and the water rights agreement, she leaned back in her chair, tapped the papers, and said, "Ethan, if this holds up with a modern survey, you don't just have a defense, you're holding this HOA by the throat." We hired Noah Briggs, a surveyor who treats boundary lines like surgery. His crew showed up with tripods, GPS rigs, and gear that costs more than my truck, and for 3 days they walked every corner of my land, cross-checking the 1953 deed against the 2004 subdivision plat. When they were done, the numbers told a story Heather never imagined. 12 houses built partly over my line. The Silver Pines Reserve Community Park entirely on my parcel. The main entrance road and those proud stone columns, sitting on ground deeded to Rafael Marquez before anyone heard of Crestline Communities. On top of that, Dr. Lila Chun, the hydrologist Ava brought in, confirmed my spring was feeding the pond and irrigation. About 50,000 gallons a day total production, 30+ thousand being used to keep Silver Pines green and pretty. While we were quietly assembling this arsenal, Heather was accelerating her war. She hired a downtown firm, Harrington and Cole LLP, to send me another letter demanding I either demolish my unpermitted industrial structures or sell my land to the HOA at a price they chose. She filed complaints with zoning, fire, health, and even called in the state environmental agency, claiming diesel spills, contaminated soil, illegal commercial use. The inspection parade was something to see. Fire inspectors checked extinguishers and exits, zoning officers measured setbacks, environmental guys tested soil, health department examined waste disposal, clipboards, boots, serious faces. They all left with the same conclusion: I was clean, permitted, compliant. The only problem they saw was a neighbor who liked to dial agencies like speed dial. That didn't slow Heather down. She called a special community defense meeting at the clubhouse, packed the room, and cried about our tranquil residential enclave under siege. She pushed through a special assessment of $500 per home to fund necessary legal action, painted me as a heartless commercial operator trying to destroy their peace. What she didn't tell them was that those legal fees were already piling up. Ava's public records request later showed almost $50,000 of HOA money gone to Harrington and Cole just to try to break one man. Meanwhile, back in the records, Ava ordered a full title search through Northgate Title Services, and that report landed like a bomb. It showed that when Crestline Communities recorded Silver Pines Reserve, they had never properly secured easements for the interior roads over my land. Legally speaking, every car driving past that stone entrance was crossing my property with no recorded right to do so. And in the HOA's own founding documents, Ava spotted a poisonous little detail. To serve as president, you had to have lived in Silver Pines Reserve for at least 10 years. Heather Langford had run and won at year 8. By their own bylaws, her presidency, her votes, her enforcement orders, all invalid. While we collected all that, Heather was spiraling. She went to local TV, to Channel 7's reporter Rachel Ford, claiming she was a mom defending families from an industrial encroachment. But when Rachel came to my place, I didn't yell, didn't rant. I laid out the deed, the dates, the maps, the inspection reports, the water rights. I showed her that my workshop stood where it had always stood, that the subdivision had wrapped around us, not the other way around. The segment that aired wasn't the David versus Monster story Heather expected. It was closer to when HOAs go too far, longtime family land versus new development. Then Rachel dug deeper and found something Heather probably wished had stayed buried. She'd been fired years earlier from a pharmaceutical sales job for falsifying data and manipulating reports. Integrity crusader, meet your own record. And still, instead of backing off, she doubled down. One night my cameras, installed just like Ava advised, caught Heather's husband, Derek Langford, on my property at 2:14 a.m., hoodie up, knife in hand, slashing my truck tires and spray painting move across my shop door. The video was crystal clear. His face, his plates, the whole thing. Detective Luis Navarro from Redwood Crossing PD watched the footage in my kitchen, shook his head slowly, and said, "He's going to hate seeing this played in court." Derek was charged with vandalism and criminal mischief. We got a restraining order. Heather went on local Facebook groups screaming about edited footage and corrupt cops. Then she tried politics. She marched into Councilman Robert Hale's office with a thick envelope and a smile, offering a campaign contribution if he could encourage zoning to condemn my property as a nuisance. Hale turned her down flat and reported the attempt to the DA. Suddenly, there was a corruption thread woven into her mess. Financially, the HOA was bleeding out. Bank records Ava later obtained showed their reserves sinking, management company Evergreen Community Services refusing to renew their contract, insurance carriers sending nervous letters as soon as word of boundary disputes and encroachments hit their desks. Property values were wobbling. Exactly the nightmare Heather claimed she'd been fighting to avoid. But she still wasn't done swinging. She filed a complaint with the state environmental agency, claiming my fuel storage was polluting groundwater. Dr. Chin's earlier tests said otherwise, but they had to investigate. When the inspectors finished and wrote up no violation, they also noted the complaint appeared baseless and might have been knowingly false, which, as Ava reminded me with a calm little smile, is a federal crime. Somewhere in there, Ava looked at me over a stack of files and said, "You understand, Ethan, if we want to, we can shut down their roads, their water, challenge half their titles, and set this entire subdivision on fire, legally speaking." And I sat there, hearing my father's voice, seeing my daughter's face, feeling the weight of 3 generations on this patch of ground, and realized Act 3 wasn't just about revenge. It was about choosing what kind of man I wanted to be with all that power in my hands. The showdown didn't happen in a courtroom, not at first. It happened in the Redwood Crossing Civic Auditorium, under harsh lights and the hum of old air conditioning, at an emergency town meeting called after the DA's office. The city and the new nervous HOA board all agreed things had gone way past neighbor dispute. The place was packed. Silver Pines Reserve homeowners, city officials, reporters, people from 2 towns over who'd heard about the contractor versus HOA president saga and wanted to see how it ended. On stage sat Mayor Caroline Hughes, Councilman Robert Hale, a representative from the county attorney, a couple of nervous HOA board members, and of course, Heather in a Navy power suit 2 sizes too big from the weight she'd lost pacing at night. She went first. Clutching the microphone like it was the last branch over a cliff, Heather Langford launched into a speech about residential character and threats to family environments, painting me as some ruthless businessman trying to turn their suburb into an industrial yard. You could hear the strain in her voice. You could feel the room not buying it anymore. When she insisted I was under federal investigation, Mayor Hughes calmly corrected her. The only federal inquiry on record involved a false environmental complaint, filed by Heather. Then it was my turn. I walked up with a worn manila folder and a stack of oversized prints. On the big screen they'd set up behind the podium, we projected the 1953 deed, Rafael Marquez, 3 acres, recorded before anyone in Silver Pines was born. Then came Noah Briggs's survey overlay, in bright lines and colors, showing where their roads, park, entrance, and homes overlapped my parcel. Gasps rippled across the room as people saw their address numbers sitting partly in the wrong color. Next, Dr. Lila Chen's report. The spring flow, the retention pond, the irrigation usage, all tied to a water right that bore my grandfather's name. Then financial documents, Harrington and Cole billing statements, Evergreen's contract termination, assessment notices that homeowners had received but never understood. I laid it out slowly, not shouting, not gloating. Legally, I said, I could shut off your water tomorrow. I could block your main entrance. I could demand 8 years of back rent for land you've been using without permission. I could drag 12 families into court and argue their houses have to be moved. And I have the right to do it. You could feel the dread, the anger, the fear. Then I let my voice soften. But I'm not going to do that. Because my grandfather didn't raise my dad that way, and my dad didn't raise me that way, and I sure don't want my daughter Lena seeing me burn down a neighborhood just because I can. Instead, I proposed what Ava and I had spent sleepless nights crafting. Formal easement agreements so roads and utilities could stay where they were. Clear water use licenses with fair compensation for the spring. One-time payments from the HOA for past use, structured so families weren't crushed. Quiet title actions to clean up everyone's deeds permanently. I just want my land respected, my family's name honored, and this harassment to stop, I said. You don't need a queen. You need a community. The room erupted in applause, and it wasn't for Heather. That's when the rest of the hammer fell. The county attorney's rep explained the charges already filed. Vandalism against Derek Langford, attempted bribery investigation involving Heather and Robert Hale, potential federal action for knowingly false environmental reporting. Then an HOA lawyer, not Harrington and Cole anymore. They'd bailed, stepped up, and, on behalf of the interim board, announced that an internal review had found Heather ineligible to serve as president from day one due to the 10-year residency rule. Every action she'd taken in that role was now under scrutiny. Someone in the crowd yelled, "We want her out," and the chant rolled through the auditorium. Heather tried to grab the mic again, shouting about conspiracies and good old boy networks. But security gently steered her off stage while cameras flashed and phones recorded every second. In the months that followed, the story finished writing itself. Under a mediated settlement, Silver Pines Reserve HOA paid me $85,000 for easements and water rights, filed new documents fixing boundaries, and agreed to strict limits on future legal spending without homeowner approval. Homeowners signed easements and got clear titles. Insurance companies calmed down. Property values stabilized. Heather Langford pled guilty to a misdemeanor charge tied to the false environmental report, paid fines, did community service, and, more importantly, lost every shred of influence she'd once had. Derek took his conviction, then filed for divorce a few months later. They sold their big house at a loss and disappeared from Redwood Crossing, leaving behind a fountain the new owners ripped out within a week. The HOA held new elections. Jason Patel, a comm engineer who'd been quietly skeptical of Heather from the beginning, became president. Maria Santos, no relation to Ava, took over finances and published every line item online. They passed the Marquez Clause, which requires a lawyer's written opinion and a homeowner vote before any legal action against a resident. One Saturday that fall, we held the neighborhood barbecue not in the park, but in my yard, on the very land Heather had tried to erase. Kids ran between the workshop and the old oak, adults lined up for burgers, and my daughter Lena stood next to me at the grill, smoke in her hair, pride in her eyes. You could have wrecked them, she said quietly. You chose not to. Grandpa would have liked that. I visit my father's grave sometimes after work, hands still smelling like metal and pine, and I tell him about how it turned out. The easements, the new HOA, the barbecue, the way the tension in the air has finally lifted. I tell him that his stubborn refusal to sell, his careful habit of saving every document, his belief that you stand your ground but don't become a monster, that all of that saved more than just our shop. It forced an entire neighborhood to grow up. Now I help other families. Through a little project we started called the Marquez Property Justice Fund. People tangled in HOA overreach, scared they'll lose their homes because someone with a clipboard decided they didn't fit. We hold free workshops at the library. How to read your deed, how to check surveys, how to push back without burning everything down. Our land is still 3 acres. The workshop still hums. The spring still runs. Only now, when I look at Silver Pines Reserve, I don't see an enemy fortress. I see houses full of people who finally understand that community standards mean nothing if they're built on lies and intimidation. And that's what keeps circling in my mind, what I'll leave with you. When someone like Heather grabs a tiny bit of power and uses it to crush everyone she can, and the rest of the neighborhood goes along with it, until someone finally says, enough. Who's really to blame? The tyrant with the gavel? Or the quiet crowd that let her swing it for so long? Tell me what you think. And if you've got your own HOA nightmare, drop it, because the next story I tell might just be yours.